Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AAAL Graduate Student Council Speaker Series. Today, it is a pleasure and an honor to have with me Dr. Wesley Leonard. First of all, my name is Paul Meighan Chiblow. I'm a PhD graduate in Educational Studies, and I'm the AAAL Graduate Student Council Social Media Subcommittee leader today. And today we have Dr. Leonard. Dr. Leonard is a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma and a linguist who has long worked as a faculty member at the intersections of linguistics and Native American studies. Supported by his experience in community language programs, he researches Native American language reclamation and works to build capacity for Native American language communities in ways that support tribal sovereignty and survivance. A collaborative project that he co-chairs, Natives for Linguistics, promotes Indigenous needs and intellectual tools as ways of doing linguistic science. So a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Leonard, and thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with us. On behalf of the AAAL graduate students, I just want to thank you for making the time and availability to speak with us today about these important issues. And I look forward to talking with you and to asking you these questions. So our team has come up with some questions that I'm going to pose to you, and you can take as long as you wish to ask any to respond, and also you can ask any questions back if you would like me to clarify anything that wasn't clear as well. So thank you again for joining us today, and I will now start with the first question that we have, and opening up here the screen.
Well, while you're doing that, let me acknowledge just also to thank you, and your team for inviting me to share my thoughts with you today. And before we actually get into questions, I wanted to give a little prelude of sorts and say, Wesley Leonard Wainswa Ane, Nila Miamia. So what I just said, you was already in your nice introduction. You just said who I am and that I'm Miami. But I want to start by noting that this is something that I wouldn't have been able to say when I was a child, even though I grew up as a very active member, of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. It's because of Indigenous language reclamation, specifically Miamia language reclamation, that I've learned to introduce myself in my language. I just want to put that out there as a baseline for what we're going to talk about.
Yes, wonderful. And thank you for that baseline. And we'll now go forward with the questions here. So the first question we have is, what are some important implications of Indigenous language reclamation for the field of applied linguistics?
Well, it's a big question. Let's see if I can answer it. But let me first clarify what I mean by Indigenous language reclamation. Yes. Recognizing that all of these bigger concepts, that are out there, whether in applied linguistics or in other fields, tend to have different definitions. A lot of my work has furthered this idea of Indigenous language reclamation as something related to but separate from the more commonly used phrase that's Indigenous language revitalization. Reclamation, as I define it, includes revitalization, that is, increasing the number of users, creating more domains of use, responding to shift in various Indigenous communities, from the Indigenous language to a language of Europe in most cases, Spanish, English, or French in the context of North America. But a lot of that work, in my opinion, overly focuses on the languages as units of sorts, and then asks questions about language users, how many there are, how they can produce verbs, and so on. It doesn't really respond to the underlying issues that precipitated language shift in the first place. So when I say Indigenous language reclamation, I'm talking about revitalization plus responding to those issues in ways that are grounded in particular Indigenous communities' needs and values, especially what they consider language to be for and why they consider language to be important. So Indigenous language reclamation is a large project that includes direct language work of the sort that many applied linguists do, but also goes far beyond that to include the broader capacity building, articulations of sovereignty, land back, and other kinds of issues that are core to language shift. So to get back to the question about important implications of Indigenous language reclamation for applied linguists and for applied linguistics as a field, I think what I just said is in fact one of the important implications. The idea that when we're doing Indigenous language work, and when I say Indigenous language work, I mean teaching, learning, producing materials for doing research related to, all of the above. When we're doing Indigenous language work, and especially when that's occurring in a professional capacity, like say by a professional researcher, it's crucial in my mind to engage with all of those other issues, at the same time, to be trained in those other issues, to bring them in to the research, and the application, whatever that might be. I would say that, applied linguists in general understand that applied linguistics always occurs in a sociopolitical context. But here, for Indigenous language reclamation, that's perhaps even more important or even more crucial to think about than it might otherwise be. For example, there's the issue of sovereignty, the notion of Indigenous nationhood, the idea that Indigenous nations have what's called data sovereignty, the right to decide how data about their language is used or not used, how it's shared. I mean, that type of issue that really sort of guides or can guide the field in productive and important ways. Another important implication of Indigenous language reclamation has to do with the actual stories of reclamation that come from my community and elsewhere. My community is one in which the language went completely out of use around the 1960s and was brought back into use, that is to say, Miamia, the language which in English is also called Miami. The language came back into use through our consulting of archival documentation and engineering of sorts, to take that documentation, which was not created for reclamation purposes, and to use that to learn the language and then reintroduce it to the community. After that had occurred for some period of time, broader general principles of language learning, of language transmission, in many cases would apply. I'm talking now about situations where parents would learn to speak Miamia and then use it in their home. And so, of course, their children would acquire it, based on having it used around them. And general, cognitive and social principles of language acquisition in many cases would apply. But we're talking now about a situation that differs a lot from normative language learning. And when I say normative, I'm talking about major world languages. We're talking about situations where so-called natural transmission is not going to occur, at least initially. We're talking about situations where people are using technical tools of historical linguistic reconstruction in some cases to fill in gaps in the records. We're talking about a situation where, and this certainly is true for my community, where broader experts in the world, including language scientists, or perhaps especially language scientists, were saying that our language was extinct and that it would not be used again. And then we're also saying that after we had started reclaiming it, that what we were doing was illegitimate, that it wasn't really Miamia, under this very colonial thinking that Indigenous languages are real only insofar as they are used and presented and talked about as might have been the case at some point in history. It's a very bizarre way of thinking and a very unproductive way of thinking, and yet it's very, very common. And so I think that those kinds of lessons, the need to sort of engage with those issues, are very, very important for applied linguistics. And I see a lot more room for applied linguists to engage with Indigenous languages and Indigenous language reclamation. Some, of course, already do, such as yourself. But But in my experience, it remains possible for somebody to be a very active practitioner in the field of applied linguistics and to have not engaged very much with the kinds of issues I just spoke about.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that wonderful and detailed response to the question. You raised so many important issues there, such as language reclamation being a much larger project that goes beyond into capacity building, articulations of sovereignty, land back. And I really appreciated the way you touched on the complex issues of what drives language shift, that languages are not quote unquote lost or endangered and for no reason. There are specific reasons for this, why languages are endangered or pushed towards shifting to, let's say, like you touched on before, world languages or dominant languages. And it was really important for you to stress the importance of Indigenous nationhood, and by giving us the example of data sovereignty, for example, the community having the right to decide how the data is used, who's it shared with. And thank you so much as well for sharing the experiences with your own language, Miamia, and how that process of reintroducing the language into the community and the role of documentation in that process. You touched on so many different issues there, and I completely agree with you that natural transmission is not likely to occur in those contexts where languages have been threatened and continue to be threatened by colonization. And one thing that I think is an articulation, a very clear articulation of colonization, is the colonial thinking that you brought up at the end that pervades the field of applied linguistics in general. And when you said more room for applied linguists like myself, that's the reason why I don't even call myself an applied linguist. I prefer to go, maybe if there is a term, critical social linguist, where I agree with you 100% that looking at the social political dynamics of language, because language does not exist in a vacuum. And so thank you so much for articulating those very important thoughts. What I would like to now touch on, Dr. Leonard, is when you were talking about the colonial thinking and the framing. So this might lead nicely into the next question that has been posed. Some or many applied linguists may say or do say, how can we as applied linguists or educators promote and preserve Indigenous languages?
Indeed, I've heard various versions of that question. I appreciate that you used scare quotes around the term preserve, around the verb preserve, because I want to do the same. But let me say that the recognition that people who work in applied linguistics, however that's defined, or even if they call themselves something else, but people who are engaged in that type of work, inherently, in my opinion, you have a role to engage with Indigenous languages and Indigenous language reclamation. Not doing anything, not saying anything is a type of engagement, and it's a type of engagement that I would not encourage, as you might guess. But so the question itself, I'll just paraphrase it as, how can educators promote and preserve Indigenous languages? Well, as noted, I would not use the verb preserve. Indigenous peoples have been preserved enough, and we have been mined enough. Preservation is great for canning vegetables. It, in my opinion, is not the right metaphor for Indigenous languages. Colonialism teaches that Indigenous peoples existed in the past, so it's existed with a big ED, past tense. And the notion of preservation, while separate from that to an extent, I think sort of falls into the same line of thinking, that there is a real thing that has to be kept in the way that it was. Whereas I think a better way to think about this is that Indigenous communities are dynamic. Indigenous communities claim languages. Indigenous communities engage in languaging. Indigenous communities, in many, many cases, recognize that their respective languages are core to their peoplehood. These languages come from particular lands. They teach us how to be members of our own communities. They provide us a tool to communicate with each other, and with, more than human relatives and with land and so on. So all of that is hugely important, but I wouldn't call it preservation. I would call it maybe support, building capacity for, ensuring capacity for in a way that also protects sovereignty. Now, the other part, promotion, I think that is a better concept, although that one has some problems as well. So I say, well, how do educators promote Indigenous languages or Indigenous language reclamation? Well, I say one short answer is to engage with the topic actively, to draw on particular Indigenous community needs and values as articulated by those Indigenous community members themselves, whenever possible, and to actively ensure that there is capacity, in applied linguistics and elsewhere for this type of work to occur. For example, by funding it, by hiring people with the appropriate training, by emphasizing it, at conferences such as the AAAL annual conference, and so on. But let me say a little bit about promotion as it occurs in a way that I think is problematic. And I admit, I've noticed this more among people who call themselves linguists without the word applied. That's to say, so-called theoretical linguistics. And I recognize that there's a false divide there, but among people who would perhaps work in a linguistics department at a university that also has a department of applied linguistics. I see it in those situations that people will say, well, I need to to promote Indigenous languages. They might also say preserve, but here I'm talking about promotion. And they will do so by taking data from Indigenous languages and putting it into their courses and into their research. I'm going to promote Indigenous languages by extracting from them for purposes of grammatical analysis or advancing linguistic theory or advancing my own research. That's not the type of promotion I want, because a lot of that type of work is extractive. It's furthering the colonial project by removing Indigenous communities from Indigenous languages. Now, I recognize, of course, there is a place for analysis of grammar, for example. In fact, it's hugely important to situations such as that of my own community, where we had to figure out those kinds of things in order to, to be able to do reclamation work. But it's always in a context that recognizes the community and the relationships of the language to the community. And so I think promotion, responsible promotion, would be, spreading ideas and building capacity about Indigenous languages and Indigenous language communities, in a way that is reclamation oriented.
Yes, thank you so much again for that wonderful and important response. I agree with you 100%, and the way you clearly articulate that not doing anything in applied linguistics is a type of engagement, not a good type of engagement. And I really like the way you said that Indigenous peoples have been preserved enough and mined enough, and an importance of how metaphors can affect behavior or lack of, or action and inaction. Like you said before, the lack of engagement is a form of inaction, that it furthers the colonial project, as you mentioned as well in your response. And I really appreciated the way, a better way of thinking of Indigenous languages, Indigenous language reclamation processes, are viewing these processes as dynamic, and that languages are core to Indigenous peoples' nationhood and a tool to communicate, and this language going beyond just how, let's say, theoretical linguists, as you pointed out, can view it as something to be mined and extracted, or a word that came to mind as you were talking, dissected. And that makes me think of that word of preservation, dissection, and it has really not good connotations in my mind. It brings to my visual horrible thoughts there. So thank you so much for clearly articulating that where we can draw on what is articulated by community members themselves, building capacity in applied linguistics, such as funding, hiring people with the appropriate training, and also spotlighting Indigenous initiatives led by community members, for example, at the AAAL annual conference. So thank you very much for that, and for that word that you used at the end there, responsible promotion. This leads on quite nicely, I would say, into a next question. A related question that comes up is ethics. Can you speak a little about the ethical issues that are important for researchers who are engaging in Indigenous language work?
I could speak a lot about it. Perhaps sort of emphasize some of the key ethical issues, that are sort of prominent, in the work that I do, and that I think are really core to Indigenous language work. First, let me note that researchers and language researchers, more specifically, operate within fixed, named ethical frameworks. In many cases where those ethical frameworks are not coming from Indigenous protocols, but rather reflect sort of broader, sort of non-Indigenous society. And there are some problems there. But of course, general ethical issues, having consent, not, harming people, clear and specific attribution, not stealing, things like that, they all apply. So general ethical principles, in applied linguistics and beyond, largely apply to Indigenous language work. But then there are some other key issues that come to mind. One, we already spoke about a little bit, which is Indigenous data sovereignty. And this notion that Indigenous nations have the right to determine how their language materials are used and shared. Let me also emphasize that Indigenous data sovereignty, although it's sort of newly being talked about in academia, is not a new concept. The named concept and the scholarship on it, tends to be more recent. But the sovereignty itself is something that just is. It's not something that was created, it's something that is. Data sovereignty is, just as other types of sovereignty just exist. They are inherent to Indigenous nationhood. They must be supported. This means then that when somebody's, especially a researcher who's engaging in Indigenous language work, that data sovereignty will have to be prominent throughout all of that. And this is not something that institutional review boards or research ethics boards or other sort of similar institutions are very good at recognizing. In fact, they often don't recognize it at all because Indigenous nations under the colonial project are not seen as nations. Rather, they're seen as ethnic groups. And we might also be ethnic groups, but let me emphasize the political status of nationhood. In many cases, especially in the United States, where most of my work occurs, these language communities correspond to sovereign political units, tribes. In many cases, those tribes have their own ethical review boards and their own, named protocols. And so it's very, very important that researchers engage with those, whatever they may be. Another issue that comes up is that while this may not be true for all Indigenous languages worldwide, it certainly is true in North America, is that Indigenous languages, or Indigenous language communities, I should really say, have been tremendously harmed by colonization and ongoing settler colonialism. Anybody who's engaging in Indigenous language work needs to engage with this very violent history, and its current effects. Realize that the power dynamics that started language shift for the most part still exist, although tribes are, actively asserting their sovereignty and building their land bases and so on, despite these violent histories. And there's just no way to ethically do this type of work without engaging with everything I just talked about and beyond. Recognizing, for example, that asking somebody, perhaps an elder, to produce the language in question might evoke all sorts of trauma if that elder has gone to boarding school or residential school and experienced violence for being who they are or for using their indigenous language. So those kinds of issues, and the specifics will vary from one community to the next, but the broader idea of colonization is there throughout. Those are hugely important for researchers to engage with. And there's another issue that I'll speak about a bit, and it's been prominent in the news over the last couple of years, although it's been an ongoing issue. And I want to return here to the notion that Indigenous language reclamation entails language work that is guided by community needs and values. Okay, the tools might come from elsewhere because they're broader tools that get developed in research contexts that can be widely applied. But ultimately, the work needs to be informed by and centered in the particular language community's needs and values. And so by extension, when somebody is not from the community in question, and that's usually the case with researchers, it's tremendously important that the researcher very actively engage at the beginning and throughout the research with those community needs and values by consulting with and having strong relationships with members of the Indigenous community. Unfortunately, there are quite a few people, including some prominent folks in academia, who are falsely presenting themselves as members of Indigenous communities that they're not actually part of. In some cases, it's outright made up. In other cases, they might have some sort of ancestral connection, but are not actually in relation to the community in the sense of being claimed by the community as a member. And yet it's possible and frankly, even common in academia for these folks who are committing what's called ethnic fraud to be listened to as if they are members of the community. And this is very, very dangerous. Say if I were not actually Miami, if I didn't have relationships with other Miami people, and yet wrote about Miami needs and values as if I were an insider, I could make anything up. And other people might believe it, especially if I'm coming from the vantage of somebody with a PhD and somebody who works in academia. And so I think it's very, very important that people be sure that when they are consulting with others, that those others are actually in relationship to the communities and that they're being accountable to those respective communities. That, of course, does not mean that any individual can't have an opinion that differs from the community norm. Sometimes I believe things that are maybe not sort of the norm for Miami people. But I think that accountability in those situations entails being clear about those differences. Saying, well, this is what's happening in my community. I personally feel differently about this for this reason, and I can do that. But the accountability needs to be there. And so, to say that in a very short way, particularly when you're citing somebody's work or drawing from it to build or to guide a given sort of research project, be sure that the person is or that the people are who they say they are, because it's not a given, unfortunately. There's a lot of fraud out there.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Leonard, for, again, that really important and also detailed response where you touched on so many complex intersecting issues and many important messages that researchers or language researchers, more specifically, like you pointed out, can take away and think about here and how that informs their work, such as consent, not harming people, being clear about attributing the knowledge, where you're gaining the knowledge from, who gave it to you, and ensuring that the Indigenous peoples and communities are centered and at the forefront in deciding how any data is shared, managed. And I like the way you stressed how sovereignty in itself is not a new concept. It just is. And this has always been an intrinsic and inherent part of Indigenous communities and nations. And it may be relatively new, let's say, to academia, but it needs, and I really like the way you stressed that, it's not new for Indigenous communities or nations. And yes, going into recognizing the political status and the power dynamics that continue to pervade the institutions, academia, and by extension applied linguistics, is not recognizing Indigenous communities as nations with their own sovereignty, and recognizing that this is a form of settler colonialism, and that researchers therefore then need to engage with colonization and colonialism and what their role is and how they may intersect, or what their intersections are with that project, that settler colonial project, which then goes into the other important topic you raised, which is trauma. Having a trauma-informed approach, that recognizing the effects, the ongoing impacts of colonization and colonialism on Indigenous peoples requires that level of sensitivity, having trauma-informed training in a sense, and also building relationships and being willing to maintain relationships beyond just your research project. And one thing I was thinking of as you were talking is the helicopter approach, where researchers can just come in, extract and mine data, as you pointed out in one of your other responses too, and then take it away from the community. And then how that ties into ethnic fraud as well, and stressing at the forefront, being accountable to the respective communities at every time. And another word that came into my head as you were talking was relational accountability, which is Sean Wilson has written about this as well in Indigenous scholarship, as you know, and also citational relationality. So always being sure of who it is you're citing, which is an extremely important point. And I thank you for bringing that up. Not just going in citing someone without actually understanding who it is you're citing. How is this in relation to the community that you're actually engaging with, or to what extent it isn't. So thank you so much for all of those really important points that researchers must engage with when engaging with Indigenous language work.
As you mentioned the helicopter approach, let me sort of build on that a little bit. Indeed, I can tell you Indigenous communities, at least all of those I've ever engaged with, and certainly my own, do not like the helicopter approach. It is a violation of every protocol that's out there, and it does not support reclamation. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
But let me also point out that in many cases within academia, where this approach is increasingly being frowned upon, is that a lot of the discussion involves the individual researchers. So-and-so shouldn't do that. So-and-so should build relations, recognize that there's going to be a long-term relationship. So-and-so should be accountable in their citations, of course, and so on. And yet the helicopter approach, extractive research, otherwise problematic research, remains relatively common, and it remains doable. The fact that it's doable reflects something about academic institutions. People can still be hired and promoted when they do problematic work. They are still, in many cases, able to publish that work. And so this raises the issue, what are academic institutions doing about this? How are they responsible for accountability to Indigenous communities? So I think that actual collaborative research needs to be supported and promoted in the academy. The helicopter approach needs to be called out when something is being considered for publication in a journal, an essay. I think it's important that the editor and the reviewers engage with these kinds of issues and say, has this researcher, has this author, in many cases they won't know who it is because it'll be anonymized, but they can still sort of engage with the piece itself. Does it show evidence of relational accountability? For the citations, are they just citing non-Indigenous academics who've written about these issues, or are they going deeper to actually provide the true intellectual genealogies, whatever they may be? Do they use the term sovereignty at all?
Yeah, that's really, really fundamental, and I agree with you 100%. Thank you for kind of also touching on the importance. Yes, we're looking at an individual level, let's say a researcher. However, we also need to look at the institutional level or the structural and systemic issues. Are the institutions being supportive, and how are these processes being promoted, as you said, at those levels? And I really like the way that you kind of called on editors and publishing, let's say, journals to look at what's the evidence of relational accountability in the work? Is it being demonstrated, and is there evidence of it? And I think on that note, I think that was all of the questions we had. I think so. Thank you. I would just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk about these important intersecting issues and to talk more about your work in Indigenous language reclamation and also the implications of this work. Important implications of this work for applied linguistics. So thank you again, Dr. Leonard.
It's been my pleasure. I really appreciate this opportunity. Mishinewe, big thanks.
Thank you very much.